Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Um, Hello and welcome to this Fair Shares webinar hosted by Anjali Appadurai in collaboration with the Climate Justice Organizing Hub, the Padma Center for Climate Justice, and the Climate Emergency Unit. So we'll give everyone a moment to get settled. My name is Sarah, and I am the Anglophone coordinator here at the Climate Justice Organizing Hub, and I'm very excited to welcome you all to tonight's event. I will also be, as sort of opener to the housekeeping for tonight, I'm going to be the tech support for tonight's call. So if you encounter any requests or needs for support during tonight's call, you can message me directly, and we will help you troubleshoot your issue. We also, this call has live translation tonight from English to French. So if you would like to enable that capacity, you can go down to the bottom of your screen and click on the interpretation icon, and you'll be in the French channel. So thank you to Leo and Mara for being our translation tonight. Secondly, this will also be a recorded session, so that is happening right now as we speak. And then finally, I'd love to invite you to share your pronouns, your name, your pronouns, maybe the group that you're associated with, as well as the place that you're calling in from tonight in the chat. We'd love to know who's with us in the room this evening. And so as a brief, just sort of intro to the Hub, if you're not familiar with us, we are a support structure for grassroots organizers across so-called Canada. And we support activists and organizers with their with needs, with troubleshooting, with being as effective and strategic as possible. So that's why we exist. And we're excited to also bring to you this big sort of movement conversation about fair shares and its importance for Canada to show up on the global stage. And with that, I actually want to transition now into my own land acknowledgement before introducing the host for tonight's call. So myself, as well as the Climate Justice Organizing Hub, is located on the unceded territories of the so-called Montreal Tiohtià:ke, and the territories of the Kanien'kehá:ka peoples, who are the keepers of the eastern door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So the island colonially known as Montreal is also known as Tiohtià:ke and Kanien'kehá:ka, a language of the Iroquois family. And it has historically been a meeting place for a diverse array of Indigenous nations. So I want to invite you all tonight to think about how what we are talking about here and also in the work that we do can be interwoven with the fight for decolonization, for the fight for self-determination of Indigenous peoples, and how climate justice is integrally and intimately linked with that very same decolonial fight. And so with that, I would like to now finally transition into my introduction of the host for tonight's call, Anjali Appadurai. And I'm really excited to introduce Anjali. Just a few years ago, I was, chairing my first meeting at Climate Justice Ottawa and was really shaken in my boots. And now, a few years later, I get the privilege and honor to introduce Anjali, one of the leading lights in the environmental justice space and work in so-called Canada. So Anjali is a climate justice organizer and communicator. As a young activist, she worked with youth movements from around the world to build a strong civil society voice at the UN Climate Convention and to ensure that social movements' demands were heard in the halls of power. Today, Anjali runs the Padma Center for Climate Justice, a project that brings together diasporic communities to build power around issues of climate and economic justice. And she works as campaigns director at the Climate Emergency Unit. And with that, I'll pass it off to Anjali.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that wonderful, beautiful introduction. And thank you to the whole Climate Justice Organizing Hub for being an incredibly powerful, energetic team of partners. It's been a joy to work with you. I first want to acknowledge that I am calling in from the unceded lands of the Coast Salish people, the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish peoples on the West Coast. And reflecting on my role as an organizer and change maker, Sarah said it so well, but my responsibility is to recognize the connectedness of all struggles against land dispossession and for decolonization and self-determination. So that's the grounding context for all our work here, and especially for this conversation that I'm so overjoyed to be able to have with all of you finally. Before starting, I do want to acknowledge something that's weighing heavy on our hearts and minds right now, and that is the conflict that's escalating in the Middle East. I want to name that I'm personally reeling from the news that's coming out of that region right now. I know many of you are. I just want to name that in this space, and to acknowledge that tensions are very high. This is a very polarized conversation, and I just want to encourage respect and a respectable way of engaging with each other in this space. We do not tolerate hate at any of the three organizations that are partnered to bring this event together. And so we have a team of moderators that's going to be watching for that. So please be respectful, and please don't bring this issue into this conversation, because today we have so much important ground to cover. And we have two incredible speakers as well. Fair shares. Where do we begin? We actually begin at the very, very beginning of my journey with activism and with organizing. And I remember distinctly this moment, and I was maybe 21 or 22 at this time. And I was part of a youth organization that I helped found called Earth in Brackets. And we would track the UN climate negotiations, and we would try to support a climate justice perspective in these talks, which often meant shoring up developing country perspectives. And I just have this distinct memory of at 4 o'clock in the morning in I forget which year it was, but we were in Warsaw, Poland, and we were outside this locked negotiating room when it was the final round of negotiations, and there was a desperate fight happening inside that negotiating room about an article in the final agreement of that particular COP that would have undermined what we call the equity principles of climate justice. And it's those equity principles that we're going to be unpacking for you over the next hour and a bit. And I remember, it was a bunch of haggard young people ordering fried chicken at whatever was open at 4 a.m. And 2013 Warsaw. Thank you, Ceecee. And we decided to do an action, and we thought of this action of holding the red line. And there's photos of us. I wish I had a photo for you today of us just lining the halls of the UN, holding a red thread and talking about holding the red line of equity. And I have not directly worked on international climate politics for many years. But the reason that I wanted to open this conversation is that now is the time. Now is the time. The time is now for this conversation. I do want to thank Climate Action Network, CANRAC, if they're here, for their work on this issue to build some of the foundation of our Canadian understanding of this issue. And I want to thank my mentors at the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice, one of whom is one of our speakers, Meena, Raman. And this is just the beginning. This conversation is just the start of what I hope will be a long, ongoing, energizing building of energy around a deeper understanding of solidarity and what it means for our local struggles here on climate. So the time is now for this conversation. We have hit a turning point in the climate crisis. All of us know it and see it. We have hit tipping points around the world. Climate impacts are accelerating around the world. And parallel to that are these troubling, concerning, rising forces of fear and nationalism within our country and within countries around the world. And so more than ever, the time for solidarity is now. It is a crucial, essential part of our collective struggle for climate justice. And it is the only way that we win. So let's get started with this conversation. I want to share some brief opening thoughts with you today, and then I would like to get started with Meena. I do want to acknowledge, with Meena, Meena's based in Penang, Malaysia, and so the time zone and her availability didn't work out. So we did actually pre-tape the conversation with Meena, and I'll say a bit more about that after my opening remarks. So let me just open. Oh gosh, you'd think I'd have this down by now. Okay. All right. Our wonderful speakers are going to dig into this concept a lot more for you. So if this doesn't make sense right away, hopefully it will by the end of the hour. But let's start with the most obvious question. What are fair shares? It was not a self-explanatory slogan. I do understand that. So the idea of fair shares starts with our path to 1.5 degrees, which is the globally agreed upon emissions target. So to keep global emissions below 1.5 degrees, we have to cumulatively reduce about 400 gigatons of carbon. Ceecee is going to speak a little bit more to this, but let's just use this number for now. This, it's the number is debatable. Like, all of these targets are so difficult to actually pinpoint in terms of the actual numbers. But let's use this number for now. It's going to be a huge effort to reduce 400 gigatons, and it's a global effort. So this global effort has to be divided between the world's governments. And the idea of fair shares is, how do we divide it fairly? How do we divide that 400 gigatons of emissions reductions fairly? Well, we do it on the basis of a few principles. One of them is historic emissions, how much certain populations have emitted for the last 300 years. We do it on the basis of the right to human development. So where in the world do we urgently need to bring people out of poverty, to correct child malnutrition and child mortality, to get people educated, to get people safe and healthy? Where do we need to divert resources to prioritize that? And we also do it on the basis of differing capabilities, recognizing that there are places in the world that are much deeper in poverty than, say, we are here on the whole in Canada. Now, this also applies to deep inequities within our own countries. Canada, as a settler state, is built upon these deep inequities as well. And Meena is going to speak a little bit to that as well. And so Canada's fair share of this global effort is a reflection of these principles and more. So what is Canada's fair share? I'm not going to say much on this because you're going to get a wonderful breakdown from Ceecee. But we have a responsibility to lower our emissions by 140% of our 2005 levels by 2030. The little star is there because this is also a contested figure. The last time the math was done on this in a very public way in Canada was at least 5 years ago. And so these numbers are now even higher. But 140%, that is, it seems like an impossible figure. How do you reduce more than 100%? That means going below zero. And the way we break down that 140% figure is through our domestic energy transition. So getting Canada transitioned off fossil fuels and towards a renewable energy economy. And that's 60% of our effort. And then the remaining 80% is our international obligations to the international community in the form of finance and technology and capacity building, contributions to loss and damage, mostly to the developing world. And so I just want to start there and not go much further. Oh, actually, no, I do want to go a little bit further. I'm going to show you one more slide. Why? The why is pretty important. Why bother at all? Several reasons. because it's fair, it's the correct thing to do based on those principles that we talked about. Because it's international law, a law that Canada has signed on to along with almost every other country in the world. The UN Climate Convention is one of the most universally adopted treaties in the world. Meena will speak more to this, Ceecee will speak more to this, and we are bound by that. We have disrespected the convention many times, but as climate activists, it's important for us to remember that there's this global agreement that we need to honor. And because sharing the burden fairly is our only chance to calm this crisis down. It's too much of an effort for any one place to do it alone. It's too much of an effort to place the burden upon the most vulnerable places in the world. And it's also because uniting in solidarity and common cause is how we win. And so when we look at things through a fair shares angle, it helps us to clarify the enemy. The enemy is not only certain governments, it's not only certain people. As Meena will speak to, there's a pattern of dispossession of land, of concentration of wealth, of corporate interests being put over the lives of people and of nature. And this is the common enemy that the Fair Shares Frameworks helps us to see. And it helps us understand truly that decolonization is climate justice. So I'll leave you with this cool image. There's so many beautiful movements around the world that are calling for international solidarity. And I hope that this conversation will be the start of us bringing much more of this lens into our very beautiful, thriving Canadian climate movements here. So I'd like to play for you the video of Meena. I do want to disclaim a little bit that the original interview that I did with Meena is a full 46 minutes long. And so I've cut it down to less than half of that. And so I want to acknowledge that there's going to be, some edit and splice, like awkward splicing that you might notice. We will provide a full a link to the full interview, which Sarah has just shared in the chat here. And I highly recommend that you listen to the whole thing because it's so brilliant and hard-hitting throughout. It's just think of it as a nice long podcast for your next long drive. Okay, so I do want to acknowledge that Meena spoke about many things that we actually had to leave out of the talk. And those included, a discussion of the Kyoto Protocol, which many of you probably heard about as one of the earliest big climate agreements. She talks about decolonial struggles. She talks about how the solutions to the climate crisis lie with the people who hold knowledge from a different paradigm, Indigenous peoples around the world. She talks about the crisis of consumption, and she talks about the UNFCCC convention. So Meena Raman is the director of programs at the Third World Network, which is an organization that provides capacity building to developing countries. And she's one of my earliest mentors. I followed her around like a little puppy at the UN. I took notes for her while she was going hard in these meetings. And, I learned so much from her. And also from her late partner, Martin Core, who was another mentor of mine. And so these are sort of giants. These are sort of real experts and with deep movement building histories, who have deeply informed my understanding of climate justice and who have so much to teach us. And Meena's been doing that work tirelessly for decades. So with that, I will begin the video. Today.
Hi, Anjali. Lovely to connect with you again.
Yes, it's a treat to have you speak to the Canadian climate movement. It's been many years since I've worked with you, and we're really excited to have your voice here today. I've already given a bit of an intro to you, but I want to start by asking you a little bit about yourself and your journey in this work, because you've been in so many places, you've done so many different kinds of work, but I know that one of the first places that you got your start politically was at the Consumers Association of Penang. And when I met you, it was at the UNFCCC doing climate justice work. So can you speak a little bit to the work you did at the Consumers Association and what brought you into climate justice work?
Oh yeah, happy to share that. I remember looking at you, I always remember where I began because it reflects so much of the young passion and energy that young people and activists have. And I think I've always wanted to do something good for the world. I suppose it's the grounding actually began more like from my own family's spiritual connectiveness that there are two types of people in the world, the good and the evil. So you're always taught that you need to do good to society, but then many people who go through that actually think that this is about charity, that when you do you go to the orphanages or you go to communities and you help with in the temple, and that's enough. That's part of your good conscience, whatever. But I realized that that's not enough, because then I began to learn through the Consumers Association of Penang, the political economy of the world. It was not just about Penang as a little island in a country called Malaysia. But it was not just about Penang. It was not just about Malaysia. It was about the world, because we were looking at development and what it meant for people. And my beginnings was actually to look at fishing communities who were facing water pollution. I mean, fish died because of factories just dumping industrial waste into their river. And we saw farmers suffering pesticide poisoning because there was this big promotion of green revolution agriculture. And so the notion of, the sustainable agriculture wasn't there, organic farming wasn't there. This was in the late 70s, 80s. Malaysia was becoming, it was a former colony of the British, the UK, the British Empire, and just like Canada. So in that sense, it was coming out of independence and in the 80s trying to address some of these basic problems in food and water and fish and so on. But what we were looking at was actually all the environmental issues that were causing impacts on local communities and people. And then when we looked behind, it wasn't just in Malaysia or people being displaced, dams, and communities fighting hydro dams, large indigenous communities being displaced, forests being destroyed. So when we looked at where all this was going, you connected to international trade, right? You connected to the production systems of the North. I mean, we got political independence, but our economy was very much connected to a development model which was very Northern-centric, a Western model of development of, people now name it as capitalism, very clearly, where the industrialism was all about producing and producing and producing and consuming as if there was no end to it. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, that's where my whole awakening of understanding the connection and the root causes of all this. So it isn't just about regulations at the national level, but actually who is driving those kinds of investments. Why are you having dirty industries coming to our part of the world? If it's no good for the United States, if it's no good for Japan, if it's no good for Canada, why is it good for Malaysia? For instance, the asbestos. Canada is a huge exporter of asbestos, and we know how toxic that is. How
it's banned in our buildings.
Exactly. But it's not banned in our part of the world. Why? Because the asbestos industry is very powerful. So then when we begin to go behind it, we see the big capital, the big industries, like what Naomi Klein's now calls the big logos. All these big industrial companies. In the climate world, it's the fossil fuel industry, corporate lobbies. So whether it was big pharma, it was big agriculture, big transnational corporations, all that pushing that. And then so all the trade in terms of, and then in the free trade agreements, the investment treaties, it was all about protecting the big guys, the big capital, and and investments, and they don't give a damn, sorry to use that language, they don't give a damn for people and the environment and the planet. Yes. So that doesn't count at all. So it was completely a wrecking of the world. And worse than that, it was actually about appropriating the limited resources of the world, which was then forests, minerals. So it was a very extractive model in which we still is today. And, it's all about the developing world in the South being commodity producers with exporting our commodities at very low prices, and which are determined by New York, Tokyo, and the other international stock exchanges and capitals over which we don't have any control. So when the commodity prices go down, we go into a huge debt crisis, and then we can't pay, and then comes the IMF and the World Bank to say, hey, here, we give you more loans and get you more into debt and more into debt. And because they have a hold over you, they have to bring in policies and frameworks which you have to follow. For instance, investment agreements where you have to deregulate, meaning you scrap regulations, make it easier for the investor to come in. And if
big companies, to be clear.
Yes, exactly. And it's similar to what you have in the North America Free Trade Agreement, the NAFTA. Yeah. How, the pesticide companies can sue government for banning a pesticide which kills people. I mean, this is unbelievable, but this is what's happening, and it continues to be the case. So this is how my education began. Right. And so I was trained in law, and at first I was lost. I didn't know what to do, but came the Consumers Association of Penang, enlightened us about this. I saw grassroots communities affected, and I had communities looking at me in the eyes and say, you're a lawyer, can you help us? Now that changed my life, because when, I said, oh, wow, I actually have a role. I was so happy. And that started this journey of public interest law, using my education and legal education as a way to fight corporations and fight governments who do the wrong thing. So that was the journey. The rest is history.
So when you went from the Consumers Association and you started doing public interest law, you started to see these interconnections, that these issues are never fully localized. We are part of this interconnected web of global capitalism, but also of life, and how the global South has been continuously extracted from. Even after so-called independence, these economic dependencies continue. And so fast forward, you find yourself working with Third World Network at the UNFCCC, which is the UN Climate Convention. Can you tell me a bit about the fight for equity at the UNFCCC?
Yeah, even before I go into the equity framework, I just want to stress that this is not just about a global South issue. This is also about equity and in the North as well. Inequity in the North.
Yes.
For instance, the kind of crises we are facing today is not just based in the global South. The communities who suffer also suffer in Canada. Yeah. The indigenous peoples who are displaced are also the same. It's the same corporate capital that actually, disenfranchises, marginalizes, destroys, pollutes, contaminates, and disempowers people in Canada as well. And these are the same forces that also do the same in the global South as well. So I wanted to say that we have to be naming that. Yeah, we need to see the deeper connections of this as a system, a systemic problem that thrives on the 1% over the 90%. I think that is what inequity is about. Mm-hmm. And the framing actually began. I think that is really, you've got to get that there's a small elites, the capitalist elites, who are hell-bent on doing everything they can to protect their profits, and they don't care for the rest of the world. And of course, you have philanthropy capital, and that's another thing, the Bill Gates and the other people, but that's another story. But the point I'm making is that we are all connected in this planet Earth in the same destructive direction that we are going. And so whatever the Canadian movements do, it's not only in the interest of the global south, but it's in the interest of your own survival and continuance and existence. So I wanted to make that connection. So before we go into the UNFCCC proper, we have to understand that where this whole equity framing came, it actually came in the Rio Summit, or the Earth Summit of 1992. Now, many of you were probably not born, and I keep remembering and reminding myself that many people may not even know of the Earth Summit. But that was a critical watershed for a lot of us because we were young people. I was a young activist like you during that time. Yeah. And so the big discussion that was happening, there was a report that came out and which blamed the poor of the world for destroying the world. So they said all these huge numbers of people who are born in India and Africa and China, they are destroying the world, they are consuming so much because so we have to do population control in order to make sure that, why the forests are destroyed, why are the poor burning the trees.
I think we would call that eco-fascism.
Exactly. So that was the framing that was coming. And then my late husband, who I must always acknowledge for being my mentor and your mentor, Martin Kaur, I mean, he was really bringing up what's called the development dimension of the poverty, the inequities, the historical colonial context of the exploitation and so on and so forth, which was so important. And it's not the poor destroying the world. So that's where I said equity is key. That's the framing of equity, that there's limited resources of the world and you have the poor who actually need them. And so this inequity between the rich, the 1% and the 90%, and in Rio, they talked about the 20% of the world controlling 80% of the resources, which is still true today. So that inequity has to be addressed. And that's why the whole outcome of Rio was reshaped to be called the Sustainable Development Agenda, where you have the environment pillar, the economic pillar, and the social pillar connecting together, and was the birth of the common but differentiated responsibility. We have a common problem, but the responsibility is differentiated because those who became rich and who were emitting a lot of historical emissions, they have to have much of the responsibility for today's problems in terms of the climate impacts, particularly because CO2 persists in the atmosphere for very, very long time. And the damage that we are facing today was part of that history. So this was actually the epitome of what the equity principle operationalized by common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. Still very important today, which was then because the Framework Convention of Climate Change was actually the daughter of the Earth Summit, of the Rio Summit. That was one, and the other was
born out of the Rio Summit. Yes,
it was born out of the Rio Summit, and the other one was, of course, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and also the Convention on Desertification. These were daughters of the Rio Conference. So that's the context of equity and what it is. And so the framing actually, the principles. I mean, if you look at the convention today, the Framework Convention, so climate activists have to begin with the convention. Don't start with the Paris Agreement. The developed world wants to completely destroy and thrash the convention. The reason because there is reference to historical emissions in the convention. And that's how developing countries argue the common but differentiated responsibility and equity and so on. And they say this is the context for which obligations have had to be spelled out. So this is why the climate justice movement has to be in the context of this frame, that it's deep injustice, and that climate injustice is connected to the injustices of all other kinds, the resource injustice, slavery, the debt crisis, the multiple crises that we're facing. So that's the context of that.
Thank you so much for breaking that down. So if I have a visual I wish I could show a visual of what you just said, but if I'm talking about this concept of fair shares, it flows from this concept of equitable access to atmospheric space.
Absolutely.
And that flows from historical emissions, from common but differentiated responsibility, and from all the inequities created by colonialism, by slavery, that original domination and imperialism.
Absolutely.
Right. So we arrive at this concept of fair shares that's informed by all of that. And that is essentially climate justice. But I love what you said. I love what you said about how this is not, us as Canadian movements doing charity to the global south or standing in solidarity just to be nice. This is about our collective liberation, and it's about all of our intertwined fates at the end of the day. So
people now use the frame of the decolonization. It's a deep decolonial struggle. It's fighting colonialism and imperialism and rooted in the reconstruction of society and rebuilding of society with that deep acknowledgement. Right. And so that means it's fundamental, it's very fundamental to how we see justice and equity.
Maybe the last question I'll leave with is, we are Canadian movements. We are at, in many ways, an interesting crossroads where we've lost some big fights and we've had a few victories recently. And I think a lot of us are wondering, where do we go next? We have so few years left to avoid many of the tipping points that we've already hit many of the tipping points. So when we think about this idea of fair shares, when we think about this idea of global equity, what can we fight for? What can we fight for as Canadian movements? We have our local fights, we have our regional fights, we even have our national fights. But beyond that, what can we fight for, and what can we be in solidarity with as Canadian movements?
I think the climate crisis is an epitome of a global crisis. What you do in Canada is not enough. What we do in Malaysia is not enough, because the problem is global. It's emissions all over the world. And so the Paris Agreement, and I don't know whether I answered your question, they were trying to wreck the Paris Agreement, but there is enough there that still has common but differentiated responsibility, developed countries needing to provide and mobilize the finance, and that all of us are in this world together to do the emission reductions, to do the adaptation, and also to address loss and damage. There's a lot there. So the Paris Agreement actually gives us the levers to hold governments to account. So we as climate justice movements hold our governments to account at the national level, and at the international level, the fair shares is a very important. So now, even if they say, our nationally determined contribution, which is the term that they use for the Paris Agreement in terms of your climate efforts, that's why you need to measure, because they say, government will say this is what is fair from our standpoint. But we'll just say, no, it's not fair, because that's why they invented in Glasgow this term net zero. Yes. And then this whole carbon markets and offsets, it's all a mumbo jumbo of false
Yes, and now you have the study showing that like 95% of offset projects are basically bullshit.
Exactly. So that is our role. That is our role, to expose the con and the pretense and the duplicity and the hypocrisy. And the last thing I'll say is that report by Oil Change International, which was so key, just released in the run-up to the Climate Ambition Summit in New York. It's called Price of Oil. And if you look at that one, the US, Canada, Australia, Norway, five countries in the world want to continue expansion and production of fossil fuels up to 2050, and which will be equivalent to 1,100 emissions of coal power plants. Unbelievable. So when the North talks about fossil fuel phase out, they don't believe them. They are not interested in the real kind of radical fossil fuel phase out that's needed today. They have to stop expansion, cancel all the plans. So we have to stop the pipelines. We have to stop the tar sands. We have to stop all that. So there's so much work to do. And I'm very energized by it, because there's a lot of action that we can do as climate activists. And whatever you do in bashing Canada would be an incredible solidarity for the rest of the world. Absolutely. So that's your job.
We have a lot of work to do as Canadian movements. Meena, I want to thank you for being here. Thank you so much for this incredible, far-ranging talk. I think we're all going to benefit from it and listen back to it. It is just such much needed analysis for our movements. Thank you so much. Thank you for evoking Martin. A mentor of mine, your former husband, and he is certainly with us, and He has provided so much of this analysis and this work for decades and decades as well. And so just grateful for you. Thank you for being here. And I'm sure I echo all of us when I say we benefit from this so much.
Thank you.
Okay, that was Meena Raman of Third World Network. Yeah, I like the little applause emojis. I will pass those on to Meena. As you can see in the chat here, there's the full interview, which is 46 minutes long, and Meena covers a whole bunch of other topics. So I just wanted to go back to something that Meena said in terms of what is our role. And she, let me pull that up for you. I think I used the exact same words here to expose the pretense, the duplicity, and the hypocrisy of policymakers who try to convince us that we can get out of this crisis without prioritizing equity and without these principles of global justice and fairness. It's not possible. It doesn't square. And so it's so important for us as movements to hold that line and to include that analysis in all of our local struggles. We have to continue to push our governments for transparency and courage on meeting our climate obligations, both here and in the international community. And we have to show our governments that climate finance and fossil fuel phase out are important to us, and we will vote and we will press them accordingly. So remember in the talk when I said, Meena, I wish I could show a visual of what you're saying right now. Well, this is the visual. And so I'm happy to send this out to folks, but just to quickly recap what Meena said, and we're about to go to Ceecee, who will explain this much more eloquently than I. But to arrive at this idea of fair shares, it really flows from this deep principle of equitable access to atmospheric space, the idea that no one human, no one living being, it should be forced to have less because they are lesser, that we should all have access, the ability to access the same amount of resources, the same quality of life, and that we should strive for that in climate policy. And to even be able to arrive at that, we have to look at historical responsibility and common but differentiated responsibility and respective capability. Those are the legal principles. And then we have to look at all the other deep inequities that are caused by the domination and the geopolitics of the world that we live in. So that's a quick recap of what Meena gave to us. I want to introduce our next speaker. Oh, actually, no, before that, we've been talking at you for a long time. So I am actually going to ask you all to get involved very briefly. And to do that, I'm going to pass it off to Sarah at the Hub.
Hey, everyone. We're going to have a little poll coming at you. So just about to launch that. We'd love to get your feedback or what you think about this question. So which region of the world has contributed the least to global GHG emissions in the last 250 years? So we invite you for the next minute or so to cast your vote. We'll see where we land. I'll give you 45 more seconds. Alrighty, last few answers trickling in. So I'm going to end the poll. Thanks everyone for contributing. And what do we got? So We've got 67% of our participants tonight saying Africa, the continent of Africa. Then another guess here of Oceania. And then South Asia in third. And actually the correct answer is Oceania. So about 1.2% of global emissions are from Oceania. And I want to show you just a quick visual of what that looks like on the global stage. So here we have just sort of a really great graphic, just kind of showing the breakdown of contributions to global CO2 emissions. As you can see, North America is unfortunately in the top here with the USA. And then we've got here in the very lowest bottom right-hand corner, Oceania with 1.2% of global emissions. So we can see here again about how the most highly impacted by, first and worst impacted by the climate crisis are the ones least responsible for its occurrence. And further, undermines what Meena was saying, what Anjali's saying, what I know Ceecee will say about how there is a strategic and moral imperative to fight this fight with a decolonial approach, with a approach to the common but differentiated responsibility that we share towards the collective liberation of us all. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Anjali.
Awesome. Without further ado, I'd like to bring on our next speaker, Ceecee Holz. So Ceecee is the Senior Research Associate at the Climate Equity Reference Project and the Executive Director of the Climate Equity Reference Project Canada. Ceecee is also an affiliated researcher at the Stockholm Environment Institute and co-teaches a course at Carleton University in their master's program with a specialization in climate change. Their field of research is international and Canadian climate change politics, with an overall research agenda focused on the role of equity and fairness as enablers of ambitious domestic and international action on addressing climate change. I've admired Ceecee for so many years that the first slide that I shared about what is fair shares and what Canada's role is was deeply informed by Ceecee's analysis, and they've contributed so much to our understanding of this issue here in our Canadian movements, in deep admiration. And they're so incredibly well published and prolific, so you can find their work all over the internet. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Ceecee.
Thank you for this very kind introduction, and I'm gonna share my screen because, otherwise you can't see my slides, I guess. Okay, so fair shares. So I want to do something. So like this, Meena's, Anjali's chat with Meena was amazing, and lots of points that I was planning to say have already been said. So that's great because I have tons of plans and little time, so it's great. So what I want to do is, well, first, review again a few of the things of why. Well, actually, I'll only do why, not who and what, on fair shares, and then look at two very specific applications of the fair shares idea. First, to global mitigation, like the reductions of greenhouse gas emissions, and then on fair fossil fuel extraction phase out, which I could not help myself acronymize as F3EPO. So let's do that. So why? I think for fair shares in climate action or in climate policy or in climate politics and in solving the climate crisis, there are three buckets of reasons. One is just the moral principle. It's this idea of it's the right thing to do. We all like to be ethical, or we should, and moral, and all these kind of things. And fairness, of course, is an overarching moral principle. And then that links into the idea of solidarity and cooperation. Instead of as opposed to charity of the people of this world in order to solve this shared problem. Then Meena already talked a bunch about this idea of the legal obligation. it was already mentioned that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is a very broadly ratified treaty. In fact, it's one of only two international treaties that have universal ratification. So that means every single country in this world has signed onto them. The other one is the Geneva Conventions, or are the Geneva Conventions on the humanitarian treatment in war. And the other one is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So all countries of this world agree with the principles and the provisions of the UNFCCC, as we call it. The word convention is missing there between framework and on. Sorry for that. And so several principles are in there. Like I quoted some things that have already been mentioned that give us an idea of what equity and fairness means broadly in this context that has again been agreed to by every single country on this planet. And then finally, there is the instrumental value. And I sometimes feel a little bit, I don't know, not so good highlighting the instrumental value, because I believe that fairness and morality and ethics should be like their own, that should be enough to behave ethical and fair. But also there is an instrumental value of acting in line with fair shares that might convince those who don't otherwise, have the inclination to do so. And it comes down to the idea, as been mentioned, that no country, even the largest, can protect its own climate by reducing its own emissions. So that means that no country can alone do anything to protect its own climate, to solve its own climate problem, right? So whatever Canada does in terms of emission reductions, this will not cause our climate change to stop and our communities to be safe, etc. It's only the actions of the entire globe that would achieve that for every country. So that means that we need cooperation. We need to get others to act, and it is more. And so in that sense, countries take actions to reduce its own emissions, to cooperate with others for the sake of getting other countries to do likewise. So that's kind of the instrumental idea, right? And so a country is more successful to convince others to do likewise if it is conceived by the others to be doing its fair share, because no one wants to be the sucker and do a lot of climate action effort when others are not doing at least what's fair enough. So in the beautifully dry language of the IPCC, this is summarized as the evidence suggests that outcomes seen as equitable can lead to more effective cooperation. So this is kind of the idea that if we've managed to build a global climate regime that is seen as equitable, then it will be more effective in order to deliver global climate action. So that's the why. Now let's jump into fair shares of mitigation. One area that I've been working on for a long time with the Climate Equity Reference Project and our Climate Equity Reference Framework. And since 2015, just before the Paris Climate Summit, we have started with the Civil Society Equity Review to publish annual fair shares assessment reports. And by now, over 400 groups from all around the world have signed on to these reports and have supported them, endorsed them. And so that is one of the areas where I've been working on fair shares of mitigation, and that Meena's group, Third World Network, has also been involved in that from the very outset, and many other organizations from Canada and around the world. And in the context of this fair shares of mitigation work, I've also worked with Climate Action Network Canada on defining the network's fair shares position, as has been mentioned a few years ago. And so I'm just showing you, I'm going to flash you some of the parts of this infographic that we created, and that where this 140% figure that was already mentioned came from, right? So this is this. And I'm going to essentially try and explain to you as quickly as I can the logic, the specific logic behind this. and then roll it back up and return to the screen essentially. So to back up, again, like the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is like this universally agreed treaty, and in fact, through ratification, countries actually it becomes the law of the land of every country that ratified it. So we consider the equity principles that are embedded in the United Nations Framework Conventions to be universally accepted equity principles, right? And so the ones that we have listed here are were already mentioned, well, except for the precautionary approach to adequacy, which means like our climate response has to be strong enough to precautionarily avoid the most severe impacts on the climate system and on ecosystems and social systems to adapt to changing climate, right? So that's the approach to adequacy. And I put for the legal geeks, I put the articles of the Framework Convention in brackets to show my sources. And so from these three big principles, the precautionary approach to adequacy, the right to sustainable development, and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, we derive in our equity framework these intermediate, we call them high-level indicators. So we think that from these, and that's like agreed to by all the 400 groups that support the Civil Society Equity Review and many other groups and some countries, that these principles can be sort of translated into these intermediate level indicators. So we need to have a climate response that is adequate enough to actually, avoid the worst impact of climate impacts. We need to take countries and individuals' development need into account, but we also need to take into account how much countries have historically emitted greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, thus creating the climate problem that we are trying to resolve, and how much have they benefited from that, and thus build up their capability or their capacity in terms of their financial wherewithal, the size of their economies, their technological capacities, their wealth, and so on. And taking all these things into account, and I don't have time to get into the details, but I have links for you scattered throughout to follow. We can then, for each country, so the total global effort is global, right? The total effort is global, but taking all these country-specific indicators into account, we can then derive a fair share of the total effort. And one quick thing, the way that our model takes, or our framework takes, development need into account is to treat, when we look at capability or capacity, countries like income and wealth, for example, we treat the incomes and wealth of the poorest people differently than those of the wealthiest. For example, we just do not consider the incomes of the poorest people to be available to be mobilized for the fight against climate change, or like for emissions reductions and so on, because they are should more appropriately be used to lift people out of poverty, ensure access to healthcare, education, appropriate shelter, energy access, access to education. I already said education. Well, never enough education, healthcare, and nutrition, and so on. So we do that. Whereas if you are like very rich and have all your needs and many of your wants already met, then every additional income above that need could easily be mobilized for fighting the climate crisis. And similarly with historical responsibility, when we look at countries' emissions that caused the creation of the climate crisis, we look at the emissions of the poorest, which sometimes are called survival emissions, the emissions that a person in this world, in this fossil fueled world, just simply has to emit in order to survive. We look at them differently than the emissions associated with the luxury consumption of richer people, and gradations in both cases in between, right? So that's how we take development need into account and ensure that we not just look at the inequalities between countries in terms of their responsibilities, but also their capabilities, but also within different groups within countries, because we acknowledge that there are poor people in the United States, Canada, and Western countries, but there are also rich people in China, India, and South Africa, and in every country in the world, and so they should be treated differently, like the poor everywhere and the rich everywhere, and so that's how our model does that. And so based on these principles and the schematic that we derive from the convention-based equity principles, we can then look at the global effort that is required to reduce emissions. So like this chart shows the global projection or baseline. If no climate actions were to happen by 2030, emissions would rise to that level, presumably. And then, but if we want to keep warming to 1.5 degree roughly, this is how they would have to develop. They have to be reduced in accordance to that with that green line. And so the whatever that color is, mustard area here is the emissions reduction that we need to avoid, right? And so that is the global mitigation effort that we need to fairly share among the countries of this world, or among the people of this world. But since we mostly work in the UN space, we think about countries. And so we can then apply our model. We have all the data in our calculator. I have the link to the calculator below here in case you're interested. And then we get results. And so we get this chart where we can say, all right, we can split this global effort among different countries according to their combined responsibility and capability. And we can say, for example, United States, as we have seen, has a ton of historical, well, many tons, gigatons actually, of historical emissions, and has tons of wealth and income. So in fact, it has about 30%, 25 to 30%, depending on how you count, of the global responsibility and global capability. So it's appropriate that it has that it implements about 25 to 30% of the global effort, and so on. And for poorer countries, these slices are smaller and in some cases so small that you can barely see them. But they are there. Every country has a fair share, even though it might be small. And so what we did is do this for Canada. And now we are back to this original chart that I deconstructed for you. So this is when we plug Canada's numbers in the calculator and make some choices, we get to this 140% by below 2005 levels by 2030, right? And that contrasts to the 42 to 45% target that the Canadian government has put on the table. And I should point out here that because this chart was done in 2019, it still shows the old target of 30%. So now we are at 42%, and so it would be somewhere around here. So as a little side remark, and so, but obviously, as we already heard, 140% is impossible. So what the groups within Climate Action Network Canada concluded is that 60% domestic reductions by 2030 would be a challenging but achievable contribution. And so we should do that, right? So that's 445 megatons emission reductions below projected levels in 2030. So that would be our domestic cut, and that would be hard but doable. At least in 2019, it looked that way. And then, but that's not enough, right? 60% is not 140. And so what do we do with the remainder? And so the idea is then to say, okay, so Canada's fair share is to ensure that 140% reductions, or this 1,039 megatons, have to be reduced to make its contribution to the global effort. If we can only do this much at home, and even if we could do 70%, it would still not be 140, right? So we cannot just let that slide. We need to make sure that that's happening, because otherwise we have a shortfall to the 1.5 degree effort. So the idea is then to engage in international cooperation, provide climate finance and support of all kinds to enable the equivalent of 80% of Canadian 2005 emissions in our countries. And so that would then add up to the 140%. And this sounds a little bit like buying your way out, but it's and offsetting and things like that. But it's not. It is not the same idea as offsetting, because what we are talking about here is engaging in deep international cooperation, where this action is in addition to, instead of the deep domestic reductions, which would be the case for in offsetting. And of course, it is also like the only way really to enable to go much beyond 100%. So and now I can show you the typical. So that, like, Canada's results are actually very typical for a high emitting wealthy country, and those here are the typical results for a less wealthy countries. And here you can see it's the exact reverse, that the fair share reductions, what the country's fair share reductions would be, is much less than, like, much less reductions than what the domestic pathway according to a downscaled IPCC pathway would be in that country. So if we want countries to only have to do their fair reduction, what's fair to expect from them, but we physically need to make them more, this is a very fundamental structural injustice, that we need these countries to do more. And the only way we can make it less unjust and more fair is by at least providing the financial, institutional, technological, and so on means to do these additional reductions. And that's sort of the flip side of the additional 80%, right? And so just to quickly summarize and then move on to the other thing, what we can see in high emitting wealthier countries, that in mitigation, that they typically, they always have fair shares that exceed their own emissions. And so that means that we need stringent domestic actions and the provision of substantial climate finance to enable additional action elsewhere. And one thing I would like to highlight is that in most cases, if not all, the scale of the international cooperation part of this exceeds, often by several times, in Canada's case by more than twice, the scale of the domestic effort. And so I think that's something for us to really internalize, is that, okay, the 60% domestic is really hard and it's a lot of effort, but what we need to do internationally is more than twice that. And I don't know, I haven't done a lot of Canadian climate work recently, but I sure don't feel like that the international support component takes as much has as much emphasis on it in the movement, but also especially in the political world and in the mainstream conversation as the domestic part. But it is more than twice as big, right? In terms of amount of reductions. And then on the flip side, the less wealthy, low emitting countries have fair shares that are much lower, and so the reductions that we need there, so any additional actions need to be enabled by support from wealthier country. And now moving on to fair fossil fuel extraction, F3 EPO. We have the Civil Society Equity Review did a report 2 years ago that just lays out the general framework, and we have a report coming up at the COP this year that will build on this framework and will establish specific phase-out timelines and support requirements for countries. So watch that space. But what we can already say is that a fair fossil phase-out, first of all, it's distinct from phasing out fossil fuel use. So that's related, but it's not the same. So all countries currently use fossil fuel, but only about 80 actually dig them up from the crust of the planet. So that's a distinct distinct challenge. And one thing that I really like, I sometimes scream at my radio, at least in my head, when I hear like fossil fuel companies in Canada talk about net zero. Oh, let's hear from one. About phasing net zero emissions from their operations, right? So because what they're trying to kind of like do a bait and switch. When we are talking about phasing out fossil fuel, we are talking about phasing out the extraction of fossil fuel, and thus also the combustion of fossil fuels, like the extraction and the consumption. But when they're talking about net zero emissions from operations, they're talking as well, we can take the oil out of the ground without emitting greenhouse gases in the process. But that doesn't help us with the greenhouse gases that get emitted when we then burn that stuff, which is much, much more than the extraction emissions. So and at the end of the deck, I have a bonus slide that shows some of these things, but I won't show that here. And extraction and phase out of extraction has very distinct equity challenges than phase out of fossil fuel use, because in fossil fuel use, at least in theory, we can just replace a fossil energy source with a renewable one, and you can also reduce your demand and increase your efficiency. But with extraction, that is not so easy, or not even so possible. And so we start with a few principles, and I highlight three here as fundamental principles. One, that the global phase out has to of extraction has to proceed at a pace that's consistent with 1.5 degrees. So we can't compromise with making the transition away, or the phase out of fossil fuel extraction slower because it's hard to do it, and then compromise with 1.5 degree limit, because, well, if we break that limit, the impacts will disproportionately harm the poorest people in the poorest countries. But at the same time, we need to enable just transitions for workers and communities, and curb extraction consistent with environmental justice. So this is a principle that acknowledges that fossil fuel extraction often is very, very disruptive to the communities that it takes place, in terms of local air pollution, in terms of working conditions, in terms of human rights abuses, and so on. Yeah, like that's a place to focus on. And then we have the fairness principles that are informing our fair shares framework, and those are to reduce extraction phase out, or to phase out extraction the fastest, where doing so will have the least social cost, and to share the costs of the transition fairly, according to ability to bear those costs. And this is a point also where we can bring those countries that do not extract fossil fuels but benefit from their use into the phase out effort. And so from these fairness principles, reduce extraction fastest, where doing so will have the least social costs. The first one, we came up with the indicator of dependency. So the question is here, how dependent is the country on the extraction of fossil fuels? And that should inform the speed of the extraction phase out. And the other one is share the transition costs fairly according to the ability to bear those costs. And that is similar with in the mitigation case, where we want to look at the capacity of countries and look at how much capacity a country has to overcome the challenges that are also associated with extraction phase out. And here, and I'm going to show you one example of how these two indicators, dependency and capacity, could be thought of. So on the y-axis, we have capacity to fund the just transition. So essentially, the idea here is that if you have a country with a higher GNI per capita, then you have more capacity to fund the transition, as opposed to lower GNI per capita. And you have a more dependent country if, in this case, more of your government revenue is derived, a larger share of your government revenue is derived from fossil fuels somehow, like through royalties or taxes or direct sales, than if you barely have any government revenue. So this is one possible indicator of dependency. There's other, I list a few others here. We also consider employment-specific indicators, for example, how many jobs are there in extraction, but also what is the level of unemployment, because it is much harder to phase out extraction jobs if you have already a high level of unemployment in your community or in your country, or if there's a presence of a social safety net, right? Because again, it is harder to phase out jobs if there is no such safety net. and of course, it's not just about it's not about phasing out jobs. It is about transitioning jobs and workers into other positions. But it's harder in that case, the more dependent the workforce is on this particular type of employment. And so we are playing currently. We've been looking at different possible indicators of dependency from a macroeconomic and from an employment perspective, and so to determine what's the best measure of dependency, like how dependent the country is on the extraction of fossil fuels. Because the idea is that if a country has a lower dependence on fossil fuels, they should really phase down very, very rapidly, because like by 2050, it all needs to be pretty much done, right? The global phase out of extraction. And so countries with lower dependency go first, wind down their extraction the fastest. And if they are lower dependency countries that are also high in capacity, they just do it on their own steam. Like in Canada, the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom, Norway would be countries that definitely would fall into this category. And then if there's a country with lower dependency, like maybe but has lower capacity, and we see like in the case of oil, there might be some candidates here, but this is only one indicator. We should have a more holistic view of dependency. Then there should also be a rapid wind down, but there might be a case to provide international support to overcome the challenges. And on the other hand, if a country is highly dependent on fossil fuel extraction in their economy and their employment, then they should be like given more time to do that, to restructure their economies, to find suitable alternative employment for the workers currently dependent on that, and the communities currently dependent on this. And again, if they are higher dependence but also lower capacity, it is appropriate to provide international support. And so that's something that we'll build out with. So this is a chart from the report 2 years ago, and this year we'll build it out with concrete numbers for groups of countries and so on. So quickly, because I am out of time, the implications from that is that, well, and some of them are from this framework, and some of them are from the high-level principles that I mentioned before that global fossil fuel extraction must be stopped first where it violates human rights. That's just like a basic principle that is consistent with environmental justice principles. Fossil fuel extraction worldwide must cease before 2050. There is also no new, and this is also important, there's no room for any new oil or gas field or coal mines to be opened anywhere in the world. So that is like it's an implication that is nearly at the level of principle, that none of this works. Really, like there's limited for us. It's really hard because we have a very principled view on fair shares and equity, and it is very hard to have something even fair enough with this very extremely constrained problem of phasing out extraction rapidly before 2050. And so it's impossible to do that if there is any new extraction, any new oil or gas wells or coal mines. Then, while countries that I already talked to us, countries are most highly dependent, will need the most time, and wealthier, less dependent countries will need to out much faster. And we are probably talking, just to give it a little bit of a teaser here, we're probably talking about the first half of the 2030s to the mid 2030s, so probably much earlier than anyone else is thinking about. And then supporting climate finance must be should be made available for countries that don't have their own capacity to overcome the challenges, but need to phase out anyway, and that should be based on a country-led needs-based assessment. But we looked at a bunch of experiences with just transition from around the world, and we concluded that the order is like hundreds of billions per year. And yeah, And this is the end. Thank you.
Photo finish. Thank you so much, Ceecee. That was a really deep dive. And this is what Ceecee does for work, and is providing just really, really important analysis for us to be able to understand our place in the world and what we need to push our governments on. So where do we go from here? So we don't have time for a Q&A. You all have been absolute champs, listening to a lot of information today. And so I would love, if you have questions, please do email me. I put my email in the chat a little bit earlier, and I will reiterate it. It's Anjali@climateemergencyunit.ca. And I can pass those questions on to Ceecee if you have any questions for them. I have no guarantees on if they will be answered, because Ceecee's very busy, but please do send them anyway. And yeah, so where do we go from here? We've heard very clearly from both of our speakers that Canada is doing a microscopic amount of what our actual fair share in the international community would be. And what can we do about that as Canadian movements? Well, for one, our federal government doesn't hear much from our movements on how they should be showing up in international spaces. They don't really face a lot of pressure from us. They don't really face a lot of heat from us. And so we have to, well, as a starting point, start this conversation together. Let's build this conversation together. Let's build this understanding together. This call was just the first step. We're going to see a lot more like this in the coming months. We're going to build this conversation and let it enrich the existing struggles that we're working on, the fossil fuel infrastructure struggles and the Indigenous-led struggles across the country. And we're going to hold our federal politicians to account. In the coming weeks, you will see from me another event for a power mapping session. We are going to be doing some power mapping on the federal minister responsible for this file, Ahmed Hussein, and we're going to be taking action from there. So first, there are two actions to take going forward. First, if you'd like to stay connected to this work, if you'd like to learn more about this work and be part of this conversation and join that power mapping session coming up, please do join the Fair Shares project that I run at the Climate Emergency Unit. There should be a link for that in the chat as well. I will follow up from this call with some resources that will be a really good sort of starter pack for the Fair Shares conversation. I can send over some of the links to the things that were discussed on this call and invitations to the next iteration of this conversation. And so that link in the chat that Amanda just dropped is the link to the Fair Shares project that I run at the Climate Emergency Unit. I'm going to pass over to Sarah to talk about how to stay in touch with the Hub.
Thanks, Anjali. One moment. Yes, so at the Hub, directly, we don't have any Fair Shares programming in the works, but we're hoping to, keep building on this conversation in many ways in the coming months. More directly, we have coming up next week a Common Horizon Network call, which is the launch call or sort of get to know the movement, a new social movement organization that is new on the block in so-called Canada. They'll be answering your questions as well as giving you a sense of what their DNA, what their raison d'etre is, and what they hope to do to fight social and economic and climate inequality in Canada. So we hope that you'll join us for that call next week, happening on the 18th of October. And then also to keep in touch with Hub events and come on out to more stuff, we have the upcoming links to our workshops on our website, and that'll also be in the chat as well. So you can keep updated there, find our newsletter on our website, and we're excited to keep building up the skills of the grassroots so that we can execute campaigns and help out with the Fair Shares as well as other climate justice initiatives. Back to you, Anjali.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I want to thank the Climate Justice Hub for being an incredible organizing force for our movements across the country. Thank you to all the Hub team members here today. There's so many of you. And thank you to the Climate Emergency Unit and to the Padma Center for Climate Justice as well. As I mentioned, you can email your questions to me. I'm going to put my email in the chat. Please do join. Please do sign up for the events that Sarah mentioned, and please do sign up for the Fair Shares Project. Let's keep this conversation going. So grateful to share this space with all of you today. And I hope you have a great rest of your night. Onwards.